It started with something as small and petty as a trash can. But what unraveled was a storm that would change the neighborhood forever. And if you've ever had that one nosy neighbor who thinks they own the street, then you need to hear this.
Oh my God.
Because what happened next will make you rethink how far an HOA Karen will go to prove her point. So before we dive into the chaos she created, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another jaw-dropping HOA showdown. The first time I noticed the trash can tipped over, I thought it was the wind. It happens. The lids get loose, the breeze carries it, and suddenly you've got garbage strewn down the street. So I picked it up, cleaned the mess, and thought nothing of it. The second time, though, I got suspicious because it wasn't windy. And the bin wasn't just tipped, it was shoved hard enough to scratch the side and dent the lid, and my recycling was scattered across my driveway. By the third time, I knew. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and in my gut, I already knew who it was. Karen. She lived 2 doors down, a self-appointed queen of the HOA. The kind of woman who patrolled the sidewalks with a clipboard, snapping pictures of supposed violations and handing out complaints like Halloween candy. She'd already harassed me about the color of my shutters, the length of my grass, and even the placement of my car in my own driveway. So a knocked-over trash can fit perfectly into her style of harassment. I set my bin upright again, muttering under my breath, but as I turned, I noticed the twitch of her curtains from her living room window. She had been watching, and when I locked eyes with that faint silhouette, I knew she was smirking. Over the next week, it escalated. Every collection day, like clockwork, my bin ended up on its side or completely across the sidewalk. My trash bag spilled open once, and Karen actually had the audacity to stroll by with her little white dog and say, "What a shame some people can't keep their property tidy." It brings down the whole neighborhood. She said it loudly enough for the other neighbors walking nearby to hear, and then she laughed as if she was innocent. I clenched my fists, forced a smile, and said nothing, because deep down, I knew I had to pick my battle carefully. If I lashed out too soon, she'd paint me as the aggressor. Karen loved playing victim. She thrived on it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she wanted me to explode. She wanted me to break so she could turn the HOA against me. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I started plotting. I began by confirming it was her. One morning, I deliberately set my trash can neatly at the curb, then parked my car down the block so I could watch from inside. Sure enough, not 15 minutes later, Karen strutted out of her house in yoga pants and sunglasses, dragging her dog on the leash. She walked past my can, slowed her pace, looked around, then kicked the side of it with her foot and toppled it over. She didn't just keep walking. Either she laughed to herself and shook her head as though she had just done something clever. My jaw tightened. The evidence I needed was right in front of me, and yet it wasn't enough to stop her. If I confronted her, she'd deny it. If I complained to the HOA, they'd take her side because she practically ran the board. So when I decided it was time to outsmart her. Over the next week, I researched. There were dozens of videos online about how to set up traps for raccoons or pests in trash bins. But I wanted something more creative, something she'd never see coming, something that would give her a taste of her own medicine without me even having to lift a finger once it was set. I thought about alarms. I thought about camera rigs. I even considered motion sensors that would blast her with sprinklers. But then it hit me. The idea was simple, clever, and perfectly humiliating. I would install a trash can that looked ordinary, but inside it wasn't what it seemed. I went to the hardware store, bought what I needed, and worked in my garage. At night, when Karen wasn't lurking around, my neighbors probably thought I was building a science project, but in reality, I was designing the perfect revenge. The plan was simple. One can would remain normal for actual trash, and the other would be the decoy. The decoy was reinforced with a hidden mechanism that would surprise anyone who tampered with it, and I designed it so it could be reset easily for the next round. The thought of Karen sauntering over, thinking she was clever, only to be blindsided by my setup made me laugh out loud as I tightened the bolts and tested the mechanism. For days, I imagined the look on her face, knew she wouldn't be able to resist. She was addicted to control, to meddling, to making me look like the neighborhood slob. But when my trash day rolled around again, she wouldn't know what hit her. That morning, I wheeled the decoy bin out to the curb, making sure it was lined up perfectly and looking ordinary. The real trash can sat behind it, barely noticeable. I took a long sip of my coffee, parked down the street again, and waited. My heart pounded with anticipation. I checked my watch every few minutes, my eyes fixed on her front door. And then, right on schedule, Karen appeared. She had her sunglasses, her little dog, and that same self-satisfied stride. She glanced at my house, smirked, and walked toward the bin. I held my breath. She nudged the can once with her foot, then pushed harder, expecting it to topple like always. What happened next was better than anything I could have imagined. When the first confrontation with Karen ended, I foolishly thought maybe she had gotten it out of her system, that she had embarrassed herself enough with her childish tantrum, and that the problem would stop. But I was sorely mistaken, because the very next trash day, when I pulled into the driveway after work, there it was again, my can tipped over, garbage spilled across the curb, and just like before, Karen was standing at the edge of her yard pretending to be busy pulling weeds while glancing at me with that smug little half-smile, as if daring me to accuse her again. And I felt that anger burn hotter, but instead of yelling across the yard, I calmly picked up the can, cleaned up the mess, and went inside, determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. Yet I knew deep down that this was becoming a game for her, and she would keep escalating it until she got the reaction she wanted, or until I stopped her once and for all. That night, I sat at my computer and searched for options, scrolling through security camera systems and motion-triggered deterrents, realizing I couldn't just rely on catching her in the act with my phone because she was too sly for that. I needed something she wouldn't notice, something discreet but undeniable, something that would give me concrete proof that she was the one tipping my can over and not the wind or raccoons like she would surely claim when confronted again. So, I ordered a small Wi-Fi-enabled camera disguised as a bird feeder. It's the kind that could easily blend into the front yard without anyone suspecting a thing. And I set it up over the weekend while trimming the hedges so she wouldn't notice. What I was doing then, angled it perfectly to catch the trash can and the curb in its view. The following Tuesday, trash pickup day. I left for work with a nervous anticipation buzzing in my chest, half hoping she wouldn't do it and half hoping she would, so that I could finally have her on camera. Sure enough, the can was lying on its side again with a few empty soda cans rolling down the street. And this time I didn't even bother to clean it right away. I just rushed inside, pulled up the footage on my phone, and there she was plain as Karen, waiting until the garbage truck had come, casually strolling across the edge of her lawn, looking around like a cartoon villain, then giving my can a deliberate shove with her foot until it toppled and spilled. Her face lit up with satisfaction as she walked back to her porch like she had just won a prize. Watching that footage filled me with a mix of anger and triumph, because finally I had her. No excuses, no denials, no pretending it was nature's fault. It was her, clear and undeniable, and that meant I could do something about it. The next morning I decided to test the waters, so I walked out with my coffee, and instead of greeting her like usual, I simply called out, "Hey Karen, do you know anything about why my trash can keeps falling over?" And she put on this fake, innocent expression, shrugging like a bad actress. Said, "Oh, probably the wind, or maybe raccoons. We've had those around lately, you know." And I couldn't help but smirk because I had already seen the footage of her doing it with my own eyes. So I replied, "Yeah, maybe. I've got a camera now, so I guess I'll find out." And the way her face froze for just a second told me everything I needed to know. She knew she'd been caught. But instead of admitting it or apologizing, she snapped back, "Well, you don't have the right to point cameras at my house. That's harassment," and stormed back inside, slamming her door so hard I could hear it from across the yard. And that was when I realized she wasn't going to stop. If anything, she was going to make this worse, because people like Karen don't back down when confronted. They doubled down, and sure enough, over the next week, she started muttering insults when I walked by, glaring through her blinds whenever I was outside. And one morning I even found an anonymous note taped to my door warning me to keep my trash cans in line, or else. Written in block letters like a ransom note cut from a magazine, which was almost laughably childish but still unsettling, because it meant she was putting real effort into harassing me. I knew then that simply having video evidence wasn't enough. I needed to take the next step. Something that would not only stop her, but teach her a lesson. Something clever and unexpected that she would never see coming. And so, I spent the next few days sketching out ideas, researching motion sensors and harmless but humiliating deterrents, until I came up with a plan so perfect I couldn't help but grin every time I thought about it. I was going to modify my trash can itself into a trap. One that would activate only when she tried to knock it over, and it would give her the shock of her life without causing any real harm. It's just pure embarrassment. The kind that would make her think twice before messing with me again. I drove to the hardware store and bought what I needed: some motion sensors, small air compressor, and a retractable sprayer nozzle, and spent the weekend building it into the lid of the can. Testing it in the backyard to make sure it would. Spray a harmless but powerful jet of cold water the moment the can was tipped. And after a few adjustments, it worked perfectly, leaving me laughing like a kid with a prank toy, because I could already picture her face when it happened. By the next trash day, everything was set up. The disguise camera was watching, and my modified can was in place, waiting like bait for the inevitable moment when Karen's petty spite got the better of her again. And sure enough, when I came home that evening, the can was knocked over as expected, but this time I didn't rush to pick it up. I rushed inside to watch the footage. And what I saw had me laughing so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Karen sneaking across the curb, smirking like always, lifting her foot to shove the can, and the instant it toppled, the sprayer blasted her full in the face with a cold stream of water, sending her stumbling back, shrieking and flailing, soaked from head to toe as she screamed in outrage and ran back to her porch dripping wet, looking more like a drowned cat than the smug queen of the neighborhood she pretended to be. It was glorious, the kind of justice you dream about but rarely get to see. And now I had it all on video, proof not only of her harassment but also of her humiliation, which meant I had the upper hand at last. The following week carried an air of tension that was almost tangible, the kind you could feel pressing against your skin even when you were alone inside the house. Blinds drawn halfway so you could spy on the street without anyone being quite certain you were looking. Karen had shifted tactics, her strategy no longer limited to knocking over the trash can, but instead morphing into a passive-aggressive campaign of intimidation and public humiliation. She would stand at the edge of my driveway, chatting with other neighbors in her overly loud voice, spouting comments like some people just don't know how to live in a community, or trash isn't just what's in the bin, it's also who puts it out, glancing toward my home each time with a little too much glee in her narrowed eyes. Other neighbors sometimes nodded, sometimes stayed silent, but it didn't matter because Karen didn't need agreement. She thrived on the attention and the insinuations. My wife Jenna grew more anxious by the day, worried that Karen's antics would escalate into something uglier, maybe even involving property damage or official HOA fines. I reassured her that I had everything under control, though in truth, I was waiting for the trap I had carefully laid to be sprung. The reinforced trash can, bolted to the ground, rigged with a hidden motion-activated camera inside a hollowed section of its side panel, was ready for action. It had already caught a few recordings of raccoons sniffing around at night and the postal worker delivering mail during his morning route. But it hadn't yet captured what I needed: the undeniable proof of Karen deliberately harassing us. I didn't want to just report her based on suspicion. I wanted to present ironclad evidence that no HOA lawyer or sympathetic neighbor could refute. On Tuesday night, the perfect storm brewed. Trash pickup was scheduled for early Wednesday morning. And as I dragged the can to its usual spot at the curb, I noticed Karen peeking through her blinds across the street, her silhouette clearly visible in the faint glow of her living room light. I gave a polite wave, more out of smugness than friendliness, knowing full well she would interpret it as a provocation. I went back inside, set the camera feed to record on my laptop, and waited. Around midnight, just when the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows and the cul-de-sac had fallen into its usual hush, I heard the faint crunch of gravel under shoes. My heart sped up, adrenaline pumping as I muted the TV and crept toward the window, staying low enough not to be noticed. There she was, Karen, in her robe, holding a flashlight in one hand and a smug smirk on her face, marching toward my trash. like she had every other week. But this time, things didn't go as planned. When she shoved against it with her foot, expecting it to topple easily, the can barely budged, its bolted base holding firm against the pavement. Confused, she tried again, this time with more force, but it didn't move. Irritation flashed across her face. She crouched down to inspect the bottom, perhaps suspecting something was different. And that's when the hidden camera caught her in perfect clarity, face illuminated by the flashlight, hands tugging at the can like a thief caught in the act. She muttered something under her breath, pulled harder, and finally gave up with a frustrated grunt, storming back across the street in defeat. I couldn't help but grin as I watched the playback, savoring every second of her failure, every incriminating detail preserved in digital evidence. The next morning, Jenna woke up to the sound of the garbage truck clanking and rumbling outside, the smell of brewing coffee filling the kitchen. I showed her the footage before she even had a chance to sip her first cup, and her reaction was priceless, a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and disbelief that Karen had been so bold as to try in the middle of the night. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked, eyebrows raised. I thought about it for a moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to immediately forward the video to the HOA board, letting them finally see the tyrant in action, exposing her for what she truly was. Another part of me wanted to hold back, to keep collecting more evidence until Karen's pattern of harassment was undeniable, until she couldn't worm her way out with excuses about raccoons or wind gusts. In the end, I decided patience was the smarter play. The more rope Karen gave herself, the tighter the noose would be when the time came. For the rest of the week, I left the camera running every night, determined to catch her again. Sure enough, she returned 2 nights later, this time armed with a long metal rod, apparently trying to pry the can loose from the bolts. The sight was almost comical, her struggling, sweating, teeth gritted as she fought against a piece of property that simply wouldn't move, all while the camera documented her attempt like a silent witness to her obsession. By the time she gave up again, muttering curses into the night air, I knew I had more than enough evidence to bury her in front of the board. But Karen wasn't done playing games. By Friday, she had switched to psychological warfare, leaving snide, anonymous notes in our mailbox that read things like "trash belongs in the landfill," "not in our community, and the HOA will deal." With rule breakers, Jenna was upset. Certain Karen was escalating into dangerous territory, but I reassured her that each note only added to the pile of evidence. What Karen didn't know was that I had also installed a small secondary camera, hidden inside the mailbox post, angled perfectly to capture anyone who tampered with it. And on Saturday afternoon, when Karen casually strolled by pretending to walk her dog, she slipped another note inside while glancing around nervously, completely unaware that the lens was recording her every move. I almost laughed at how easy she made it. It wasn't just harassment anymore. Tampering with mail was a federal offense, something that could bring far more trouble than an HOA slap on the wrist. Now I had a decision to make. Should I handle this within the neighborhood by bringing the footage to the HOA board? Or should I escalate things beyond Karen's imagination and involve federal authorities who wouldn't take her behavior lightly? The thought of Karen being blindsided by actual law enforcement was tempting, but I knew I had to play my cards carefully. For now, I kept everything on file, knowing her downfall was inevitable. That night, I sat at my desk scrolling through the recorded footage, piecing together a timeline of Karen's antics. Each clip was a new nail in the coffin, Karen, pushing, pulling, prying, and stuffing notes where they didn't belong. I imagined the look on her face when she realized she wasn't the clever puppet master she believed herself to be, but the star of her own downfall. The power dynamic was shifting, and she didn't even know it yet. My trap had worked, and now it was only a matter of time before Karen's empire of intimidation collapsed around her. But what I didn't realize was that Karen, in her desperation, was already planning her next move, one that would push our feud beyond simple harassment and into dangerous. Sunday morning carried with it a deceptive calm, the kind of quiet that made you think maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. Though I knew better than to believe Karen had given up so easily, because people like her didn't stop when confronted. With resistance, they doubled down, twisted, schemed, and found new ways to try and assert control. The video evidence I had been collecting was solid enough to destroy her credibility in front of the HOA. But I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment when her hypocrisy and harassment would be undeniable to everyone in the neighborhood, and until then, I kept the recordings stored, backing them up on multiple drives so nothing could mysteriously disappear. Jenna urged me to just turn the footage in right away, especially after the mailbox note incident, but I told her patience was key. That Karen was digging her own grave one action at a time, and I intended to let her keep going until she was neck deep. That afternoon I decided to mow the lawn, trying to keep up the appearance of normal suburban life. But as I pushed the mower toward the side of the yard, closest to Karen's house, I noticed her standing by her window again, phone in hand, recording me. At first I thought maybe she was just looking for another angle to complain about noise violations. But then I realized she wasn't recording the lawnmower. She was recording me. I cut the engine, walked closer to the property line, and shouted, "Is there a problem, Karen?" She snapped her blinds shut, but a few minutes later, she was outside, dog leash in hand. Phone still recording as she walked slowly along the sidewalk, muttering about non-compliant residents and HOA enforcement. It was then I realized Karen was escalating not just physically but legally. She was trying to build her own case against me, maybe even twisting reality to claim I was harassing her. It was laughable, but it also meant she was dangerous, because people like Karen knew how to play the victim card, how to cry wolf just convincingly enough to get others to side with them. That evening, around dinner time, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, 2 uniformed HOA representatives stood there, clipboards in hand, trying their best to look official even though they were just neighbors with too much time on their hands. "We've had complaints," one of them said, a middle-aged man named Bill, who always seemed to hover around Karen like a loyal henchman. "About what?" I asked flatly, though I already knew. "Noise, improper lawn maintenance, and suspicious behavior," Bill replied, reading from his notes. Jenna, who had come up behind me, scoffed loudly. "Suspicious behavior? Like mowing the lawn?" Bill avoided her eyes, clearly uncomfortable but still determined to do Karen's bidding. "Look," I said calmly, "if Karen has complaints, she should bring them up directly instead of hiding behind the board." The other representative, a woman named Sandra, spoke up then, her tone less hostile. "We're just here to mediate, not take sides. But if there are issues, we have to address them." I considered showing them the footage right then and there, exposing Karen for the liar she was, but I held back. "Instead," I said, "I have evidence that might change your perspective, but I'm choosing not to share it just yet. All I ask is that you remember this conversation when the truth comes out." Sandra gave me a curious look, almost like she wanted to press further, but Bill was eager to wrap things up, jotting something down and saying they'd report back to the board. As they left, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, that smug little smirk plastered on her face, as if she had won some small battle. I waved at her again, deliberately casual, and the way her face twitched told me she hated not knowing what cards I was holding. But Karen wasn't content to rely on the HOA alone. That night around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud bang outside, followed by the screech of tires tearing down the street. I rushed to the window, and my blood boiled when I saw my trash can knocked over. Garbage scattered across the lawn, lid cracked from the impact of what looked like a vehicle having rammed it. The bolts had held, but the can itself was damaged, plastic shards littering the curb. I checked the camera feed immediately, and sure enough, the footage captured everything. A car creeping down the street with its headlights off, pausing in front of my driveway, then suddenly accelerating and slamming into the can before peeling away. The kicker? The camera caught the license plate crystal clear, and when I ran it through a search the next day with a friend who had access to DMV databases, it came back registered to none other than Karen's son. She hadn't just escalated, she had enlisted family to join her vendetta. That was the moment Jenna begged me to go straight to the police, but I still hesitated. My plan had shifted now, becoming less about HOA drama and more about protecting ourselves from what was turning into a coordinated campaign of harassment. But I wanted Karen to expose herself fully, wanted every dirty trick, every illegal stunt, every smear campaign captured on record so that when I finally went public, she wouldn't just face embarrassment, she'd face consequences she couldn't wiggle out of. The following day, Karen doubled down on her victim act, cornering neighbors on the sidewalk, telling them I had been threatening her, that I was unstable, and that she feared for her safety. I watched from my porch as she gestured dramatically, pointing toward my house like it was some menace to the neighborhood. Some people nodded sympathetically, others looked skeptical, but the fact that she was spreading lies at all infuriated me. Jenna wanted to confront her right then and there, but I stopped her. Let her talk, I said. Every word out of her mouth is just another piece of evidence. Later that evening, I decided to raise the stakes myself. I took the best clips, the ones of her tampering with the trash can, stuffing notes in our mailbox, and her son's car slamming into our property, and saved them onto a USB drive. Then, without saying a word to Jenna, I drove to Sandra's house. She answered the door looking surprised, but invited me in when I told her it was about the HOA. I showed her the footage, one clip at a time, watching her face shift from skepticism to shock to outright anger.
Yes.
This is bad, she said, softly, clearly disturbed. Does the board know about this? I shook my head. Not yet. But when they do, I want them to hear it from someone who isn't me, someone impartial. I trust you to handle this carefully. Sandra hesitated, then nodded. I'll bring it up at the next meeting, but you need to be careful. Karen has friends on the board. I thanked her, knowing that was true, but also knowing the truth was stronger than any friendship. When I got home, Jenna was waiting, upset that I hadn't told her where I was going, but when I explained what I had done, she relaxed a little. So what now? She asked. I sighed, staring out the window at Karen's house, her porch light glowing like a watchtower across the street. Now, I said, we wait. And when the time is right, we make sure Karen can never pull this kind of stunt again. What I didn't know then was that Karen was already preparing her most desperate move yet. One that would drag the police directly into our neighborhood feud and force everyone to pick a side once and for all. When the morning came, I walked outside to check on the trash can and was relieved to see it standing exactly where I left it, untouched, upright, and free from any tampering. The hidden camera I had tucked inside the reinforced shell was still, blinking, quietly recording everything that happened through the night. And the heavy base that kept the can firmly grounded meant that even if Karen had tried to shove it again, it wouldn't have moved. I stood there on the driveway, coffee in hand, looking around at the seemingly peaceful neighborhood that hid so much pettiness, and wondered if Karen had finally realized her antics weren't going to break me anymore. Just as I was thinking about it, I saw her blinds twitch from across the street. And there she was, peeking out like a predator, waiting for a chance to strike. She froze when she saw me looking back, then immediately ducked away, which only confirmed to me that she wasn't finished yet. That day, I decided to check the footage, and sure enough, around midnight, Karen had marched across the street in her robe, clearly believing the cover of darkness would make her invisible, and tried pushing the can over. The best part was watching her struggle. She shoved, she pulled, she even kicked it, but the trash can didn't budge an inch. Frustration boiled on her face as she whispered something under her breath, then stormed off like a spoiled child. Watching her fail so miserably gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks, but it also told me she wasn't going to quit easily. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She was going to escalate, and I needed to be ready. I spent the rest of the morning planning. If she wanted to keep turning this into a battle, then I would make sure every move she made would only dig her hole deeper. Later that afternoon, I visited a friend who worked in security installations. I told him about my situation, and he laughed, shaking his head, saying it sounded like something out of a neighborhood drama series. But he also knew Karen's type and gave me advice on more sophisticated surveillance, tiny hidden cameras that could capture sound as well as video, along with motion-activated alerts that would ping my phone the moment she got too close. Bought the whole setup and spent the weekend installing it around the driveway, the yard, and even tucked one under the mailbox, making sure every angle was covered without being obvious. By Sunday evening, my property looked no different than before, but in reality, it was a fortress of evidence-gathering technology. That same night, as if the universe wanted to prove my paranoia right, the alerts started coming in. Karen had come back. This time she wasn't alone. And from the footage, it looked like she was trying to convince him that the trash can was a problem. He half-heartedly tugged at it, probably to appease her, but it was clear he thought the whole thing was ridiculous. He eventually gave up, throwing his hands in the air and walking away, leaving Karen fuming. She circled the can a few more times like she was plotting a crime before stomping back across the street. Watching it live on my phone, I almost laughed out loud, but then I thought about how she might try to come back again with more determination. My reinforced trash can had become a symbol of defiance, and to Karen, that was intolerable. On Monday, I decided to take it one step further. Called the local waste management service and explained the situation, asking them if they had any issues with me reinforcing my trash can. The supervisor chuckled when I explained how my HOA neighbor kept trying to knock it over. He reassured me that as long as the can was accessible for collection, they had no problem with it. That was the final nail in Karen's complaint. Coffin, because she could no longer claim it violated waste management rules. Armed with that knowledge, I felt bulletproof. That afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, Karen marched straight toward me, waving her arms. "This trash can of yours is an eyesore and a hazard," she barked, her face red with anger. I calmly rolled down my window and said, "Funny, the waste management supervisor said it's perfectly fine. Maybe you should take your complaints." "Up with them." She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, clearly unprepared for me to have done my homework. Her voice cracked as she muttered something about property values before storming back across the street. I had struck a nerve. That night, I reviewed the footage again, and what I saw confirmed everything I suspected. Karen returned yet again, this time with a flashlight, circling the trash can like she was inspecting it for weaknesses. She tugged on the lid, kicked the sides, and even tried to lift it, but nothing worked. The camera caught every second of her tantrum, and as I watched her storm off yet again, I realized this was no longer just about a trash can to hurt, it was about control. Karen thrived on being the queen of the neighborhood, and my refusal to bow to her petty power trip was driving her insane. I saved the footage in a secure drive, labeling it Karen vs. Trash Can, Episode 3, and laughed at the thought of how ridiculous this whole saga had become. Still, I knew that ridiculousness could turn dangerous if she decided to escalate further. And as much as I hated to admit it, I had a gut feeling that the real showdown was still coming. The next day, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was from the HOA board, and of course, it was a formal complaint about my trash can. They claimed it was non-standard and disruptive to community uniformity. I couldn't help but laugh, because I knew exactly where that complaint came from. Karen had run out of personal tactics, so she had gone crying to the HOA. What she didn't know was that I had every piece of evidence showing her harassment. I was ready to unleash it if they pushed too hard. As I sat there holding the letter, I thought to myself, Karen has no idea what's coming. The HOA complaint letter sat on my kitchen counter all night like an invitation to war. I spent hours deciding how I would respond. Part of me wanted to storm into the next board meeting, slam down my stack of video evidence, and call out Karen publicly for what she was, a nosy, power-hungry bully who thought she could dictate every neighbor's life. But the other part of me wanted to play the game smart, to let her dig her own grave while I stacked the cards higher and higher against her. In the end, I chose patience, because patience meant control, and control meant that when the time came, Karen wouldn't just lose, she would be humiliated. So I drafted a calm and professional response to the HOA, citing my conversation with waste management, the fact that my reinforced trash can met all accessibility requirements, and reminding them politely that the bylaws did not specify any restriction on modification for stability. I included pictures of the can standing neatly on my driveway, looking no different than any other, and I sent the letter back certified so I had proof of receipt. It felt good, like a preemptive strike wrapped in courtesy. The very next day, Karen cornered me in the driveway again, practically foaming at the mouth as she accused me of defying the board. I smiled calmly and said, "Actually, I responded with all the necessary documentation. I'm sure they'll see through." Baseless complaints. The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of shock and fury, as if she couldn't fathom me refusing to roll over. That night, the motion alerts on my phone went off again, and when I checked the feed, I nearly spit out my drink. Karen had shown up with a hammer. She crouched next to the trash can, looking around nervously, then started whacking at the base, like she was trying to chip away at it. The thuds echoed through the recording, and I could see her face twisted in rage as the reinforced shell absorbed every blow. After a few minutes, she grew tired, dropped the hammer, and muttered something. Before storming back home, I knew right then it was time to stop holding back. The next morning, I filed a police report for property harassment and presented the footage as evidence. The officer who took the report chuckled when he saw Karen swinging at my trash can like a maniac, but he assured me they would log the incident and issue a warning. That same afternoon, I watched from my window as a patrol car pulled up to Karen's house. 2 officers walked up her driveway, and I could only imagine the conversation inside. When they left, Karen stood in her doorway, red-faced and seething, glaring at my house like it was the source of all her misery. And maybe it was, because I had finally built something she couldn't control. Later that week, HOA sent a follow-up letter saying they were reviewing the complaint and would issue a decision at the next monthly meeting. That gave me an idea. If Karen wanted to drag the HOA into this, then Fee and I would make sure everyone on that board knew the truth. I spent the next several evenings compiling a meticulous folder of every piece of evidence, timestamps of her nightly visits, video footage of her attempts to knock the can over, the hammer attack, and even her dragging her husband into the mess. I printed still shots, burned copies of the videos onto a flash drive, and wrote a clear timeline of events. By the time I was finished, my Karen dossier looked like something straight out of a detective's case file, and I couldn't wait to see her face when it all came to light. On the night of the HOA meeting, I walked into the community. Sent her with that folder under my arm, calm as ever, while Karen was already there, pacing like a caged tiger. She glared at me the moment I entered, muttering to another neighbor, no doubt poisoning them with her version of events. When the board brought up the complaint, Karen pounced, standing up and shouting about how my trash can was an abomination and a threat to community order. She threw out words like unsanitary and unsafe, and it was clear she thought she was giving some grand speech. Then the board turned to me for a response, and that's when I opened the folder. Calmly, I placed the printed photos on the table one by one, showing Karen prowling around my driveway at night, showing her swinging a hammer like a lunatic, showing her crouched in her robe trying to shove the can. The room went silent. Gasps came from a few neighbors as I handed the flash drive to the chairman and said, "And if you'd like to see the videos, here's the full footage." Karen's face went pale, then beet red, as she sputtered excuses. But no one was listening anymore. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly realizing that the issue wasn't my trash can at all, it was Karen's obsession. One of them even said, "This seems less like a problem with his trash can and more like harassment." And just like that, the tables turned. Karen stormed out of the meeting before it even ended, her composure shattered, and I knew in that moment that her reign of terror was crumbling. Walking back to my house that night, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time since this nonsense began, I felt like the neighborhood was on my side. But deep down, I also knew Karen wasn't the type to give up completely. She was cornered. Now, and a cornered animal was always the most dangerous. I had won the battle, but something told me the war wasn't over yet. After that HOA meeting where I exposed Karen in front of everyone, the neighborhood energy shifted, though not in a way that completely put me at ease. For a couple of days, she stayed quiet, her house dark at night, her driveway empty of her usual hovering presence, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally been humiliated enough to back off. But then the whispers started. Little murmurs from neighbors who stopped me on my morning walks or waved at me in the evening and muttered about how Karen was going door to door, spreading her own twisted version of the story. She claimed I had doctored the footage, that I had set her up, and even went so far as to insist I was some sort of unstable man with surveillance obsessions. It was laughable, but I could see the seeds of doubt being planted. In some people's eyes, the way gossip worms its way into otherwise rational minds, that was when I realized Karen's game had only changed, not ended. One night, just as I was locking up, my motion camera pinged again. This time it wasn't Karen, at least not directly. It was her teenage nephew who'd up, creeping across my lawn with a can of spray paint. He scrawled big, ugly words across the side of my trash can. Something about being a creep, before running back across the street into her yard. I wasn't. Even Angry A almost laughed, because the camera had caught the whole thing in perfect clarity. The next morning, I filed another police report, attached the footage. And this time the officer promised they'd escalate the matter if the harassment didn't stop. Later that day, Karen was served with a formal warning from law enforcement. I watched from my window as she stood in her driveway screaming at the officer, pointing at my house as if I were the criminal, while the cop just shook his head and walked away. It should have ended there, but of course it didn't. The next HOA meeting, she didn't even try to bring up my trash. She tried to get me banned from community events. She argued I was destabilizing the neighborhood, that my cameras were spying on families, and that I was creating an unsafe environment. The board shut her down quickly, reminding her of the evidence. But I could see how desperate she was becoming, clawing for any leverage she could find. That's when I realized the best way to end this once and for all wasn't just to defend myself, it was to flip the spotlight fully onto her. I compiled everything, the videos, the graffiti, the police reports, the HOA minutes, and I drafted a letter addressed to every single household in the neighborhood. In it, I explained calmly what had been happening, how many times Karen had harassed me, how many times she had vandalized my property or sent others to do it, and I included still shots from the videos. I didn't embellish, didn't attack her character. I simply laid out the truth. One evening, I walked door to door delivering those envelopes, smiling politely and saying, "Only this is something I thought you should know." By the end of the week, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with me now crossed the street to shake my hand. People whispered openly about Karen, not me, and for the first time, she was the one under the microscope. Her power, her control, her ability to bully people into submission was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. A week later, the HOA board announced they were holding a special vote to determine if Karen should be removed from her position due to conduct unbecoming of a board member. At that meeting, she tried one last desperate speech, shrieking about conspiracies and betrayal, but it fell flat. One by one, the neighbors raised their hands, and the motion passed. Karen was out. I'll never forget the look on her face as she gathered her papers, lips trembling with rage, storming out of the room without another word. That night, my cameras didn't ping. My trash can stayed upright, and the air felt lighter than it had in months. Still, I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her don't just fade into the background quietly. A week after she was voted out, her house went on the market. The sign went up in the yard, and suddenly it all made sense. Hadn't been fighting for rules or order or the neighborhood. She had been fighting because she was losing everything, and she couldn't stand to lose control on top of it. Watching that for sale sign sway in the wind felt like the true end of the battle. But the victory wasn't just about the trash. Or the HOA, or even Karen, it was about standing up to a bully, about proving that patience and evidence and persistence could outlast even the loudest, nosiest tyrant on the block. And yet, as I sat on my porch that evening, sipping a drink and looking at my unblemished, perfectly upright trash can, I couldn't help but wonder wherever Karen ended up next. Whose trash can she'd decide to knock over, and whether that poor neighbor would be ready for the storm that came with her. Because one thing was certain, Karen wasn't the type to ever change. She was the type to just move the fight somewhere else. If you want to hear how stories like this play out, the battles between neighbors, HOAs, and the Karens of the world, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now to Sham Stories and stay ready for the next jaw-dropping tale. ***